Hey everybody, we're back. All right, so this video, similarly to Bloom, we're going to quickly run through another really important essay, T.S. Eliot's Tradition and the Individual Talent. Much shorter than Bloom, but every bit as dense. But again, we're just going to look at the highlights. So let's go to week 2. Here is the essay. So you have my Bloom essay up there. And here we go. Here's T.S. Eliot, the famous T.S. Eliot, Tradition and the Individual Talent. Eliot's a famous poet. We'll look at Prufrock later in the semester, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Most famous poem, 1922's The Wasteland. And this is written before that. But all right, here we go. In English writing, we seldom speak of tradition, though we occasionally apply its name in deploring its absence. We cannot refer to the tradition or to a tradition. At most, we employ the adjective in saying that the poetry of so and so is traditional or even too traditional. Seldom, perhaps, does the word appear except in a phrase of censure. That means is when we say something necessarily like this, so and so is traditional or too traditional, that's a negative connotation. That's a negative term. If otherwise, it is vaguely appropriative, negative, right? With the implication as to the work approved of some pleasing archaeological reconstruction. You can hardly make the word agreeable to English ears without this comfortable reference to the reassuring science of archaeology. So Eliot in this first paragraph saying at this time, when something's traditional, it's used as a pejorative, as a negative connotation. It's a negative statement. And he's pushing back against that in this essay. But he's going to do two things kind of that's very similar to Bloom, which I would argue Bloom was highly influenced by this essay. Eliot's arguing that we need to know the tradition of poetry, but then to also break from that tradition and make it new. Certainly, the word is not likely to appear in our appreciations of living or dead writers. Every nation, every race has not only its own creative, but its own critical turn of mind, and is even more oblivious to the shortcomings and limitations of its critical habits than of those of its creative genius. We know or think we know from the enormous mass of critical writing that has appeared in French language. Here's this part. The critical method or habit of the French. We only conclude that the French are more critical than we, and sometimes even plume ourselves a little with the fact, as if the French were the less spontaneous. Perhaps they are, but we might remind ourselves that criticism is as inevitable as breathing, and that we should be none the worse for articulating what passes in our minds when we read a book and feel an emotion about it. This is important right here, right? This moment. For criticizing our own minds is their work of criticism. One of the facts that might come to light in this process is our tendency to insist when we praise a poet upon those aspects of his work in which he least resembles anyone else. All right, so now we're getting into some of the meat of this here. This is a really important part, this part I have highlighted here. So just kind of zoom in and focus this. One of the facts that his work in which he least resembles anyone else, in these aspects or parts of his work, we pretend to find what is individual. That's what we do. What is the peculiar essence of the man, woman, person? We dwell with satisfaction upon the poet's difference from his predecessors, especially his immediate predecessors. We endeavor to find something that can be isolated in order to be enjoyed. Whereas if we approach a poet without this prejudice, we shall often find that not only the best, but the most individual parts of his work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, right here, this is important, assert their immortality most vigorously. And I do not mean the impressionable period of adolescence, but the period of full maturity. So what Eliot's arguing here is sometimes we find poet, you can plug in any artist, right? Singer, songwriter, artist, actor, whatever, who they're original. But what Eliot's arguing is that that originality is based off of this historical knowingness, knowing history, and then making the intervention to make it new. Yet, here's the turn, right? This yet, this conjunction here. This is really important, this part. Yet, if the only form of tradition of handing down consisted in following the ways of the immediate generation before us in a blind or timid adherence to its successes, tradition should positively be discouraged. So if we think of tradition merely as mimicking, just repeating what has come before, and that's it, then it should be discouraged. We have seen many such simple currents soon lost in the sand, and novelty is better than repetition. All right, here's Eliot's one of his main arguments right here, right? This next sentence is really important. Tradition is a matter of much wider significance. And Eliot's talking about tradition, poetic tradition, literary tradition here. It cannot be inherited. You can't just inherit it. And if you want it, you must obtain it by great labor. You must read everything, right? You got to read. You got to know what's come before you. It involves, in the first place, the historical sense, which we may call nearly indispensable to anyone who would continue to be a poet beyond his 25th year. And the historical sense involves a perception not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. The historical sense compels a man to write, man, woman, or person, to write not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with the feeling that the whole of the literature of Europe from Homer, and within it the whole of the literature of his own country, has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. So we must know what has come before us, right? We must know those things. It's important. This historical sense, which is a sense of the timeless as well as of the temporal, and of the timeless and of the temporal together, is what makes a writer traditional. And it is at the same time what makes a writer most acutely conscious of his place in time, of his contemporaneity. So what Eliot's arguing a great poet does is similar to Bloom, right? You know the past, and this is way before Bloom's essay. You know the past, you ingest the past, you're knowledgeable of it, and you make it new. You make it your own. This is a famous statement, and I want to see what you think. No poet, no artist of any art has their complete meaning alone. There is no poem, no book, no movie, no painting, no song that exists in a vacuum. Their significance, appreciation, is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. You cannot value him alone. You must set him for contrast and comparison among the dead. I mean this as a principle of aesthetic, not merely historical criticism. The necessity that he shall conform, that he shall cohere, is not one-sided. What happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art which preceded it. All right, we're going to skip around a little bit, right? That's really important. I'm not going to read this word for word, but you're getting the gist of it, right? And the poet who is aware of this will be aware of the great difficulties and responsibilities. And we have two things. We're moving on a little bit. Standards of the past, judge not amputate them, right? And we have two things are measured by each other, right here. To conform merely would be for the new work to not really to conform at all. It would not be new. So if a new poet, new artist is just merely repeating the past, why? It's nothing new. We do not quite say that the new is more valuable because it fits in, but its fitting is a test of value. All right. So okay, I want to skip around. I don't want to spend too much time on this. All right, the first course, to proceed to a more intelligible exposition of the relation to the poet to the past. They can neither take the past as a lump, as an indiscriminate bolus, nor can he himself wholly on one of the two private admirations, nor can he form himself wholly upon one preferred period, right? You can't just take the past and mimic it. You can't just take the past. The poet must be, this is important right here. The poet must be very conscious of the main current. You got to know what's going on now, which does not at all flow invariably through the most distinguished reputations. They must be aware of the obvious fact that art never improves, but that the material of art is never quite the same. Think back to Bloom's statement. Everything has been done, but as long as you make it new, you can still do everything. It doesn't matter as long as you make it new, right? And these are the changes here he talks about. We have reference to Shakespeare and Homer and all that stuff. All right, let's skip along because I want to get through this. You're getting the gist of this essay, right? What is to be insisted upon is that the poet must develop or procure the consciousness of the past, and that they should continue to develop this consciousness throughout the career. Again, this is this reference why tradition is important. We must know what has come before. We must develop the consciousness of the past and make it new in the present. All right? Right here, I want to just zoom in on this moment. where Eliot says, I tried to point out the importance of the relation of the poems to other poems by other authors and suggested the conception of poetry as a living whole of all the poetry has ever been written. The other aspect of this impersonal theory of poetry is the relation of the poem to its author. This is important too here, right? I like this moment because I have bones to pick with Eliot, kind of like I did with Bloom here. And I hinted by an analogy that the mind of the mature poet differs from that of the immature one, not precisely in value, in any valuation of personality, not being necessarily more interesting or having more to say, but rather by being a more finely perfected medium with special or very varied feelings are at liberty to enter into new combinations. Right here. And I'm going to read this part, reflect on it, and then we'll move on. The mind of the poet is the shred of platinum and may partly or exclusively operate upon the experience of the person, but the more perfect the artist, the more completely separate in him will be the man who suffers and the mind which creates. The more perfectly will the mind digest and transmute the passions which are its material. All right, so what all Eliot is arguing and saying here is Eliot's definition of a great poet. You obviously subsume the past, you eat the past, you make it current, you make it new. Also, to Eliot, a great poet doesn't just profess their emotions. They're not just dumping emotionally their personal life onto the page, right? They're making it new. They're also using other aspects of life. It's not just my own personal life whining and crying. This is before, though. This is fascinating, this moment here, because we're going to pick on Eliot too, and you can kind of see Henri Cole's Oil and Steel pushes against that, because that is a very personal poem. However, Cole takes the history of poetry. We're working with the sonnet form. We're working with these tight constructed language, and you're taking those two things. Eliot doesn't like a lot of personal stuff in his poems, though. So that's where he's railing against. And kind of like in the Bloom essay, when we read our diverse writers, and we're going to test it against that, we're going to read, and we have been reading a lot of personal writers, and I think those poems can hold up by this as well. All right? And, we have this at the bottom here. This is another important moment. The experience, you will notice the elements which enter in the presence of the transforming catalyst are of two kinds, emotions and feelings. The effect of a work of art upon the person who enjoys it is an experience different in kind from any experience not of art. It may be formed out of one emotion, or may be a combination of several, and various feelings, inhering for the writer in particular words or phrases or image. Eliot's kind of eschewing, he wants to get rid of emotion here, right? He wants to be an emotionally distant. Think of, though, it's odd, though, we can think of Henri Cole's Oil and Steel again, where it's a personal poem. Its tone, though, it's kind of withdrawn, right? It's steel. It has that steel in the title. What's inherited from the father, obviously, is the knack for solitude, which enables the poem to be written. But what's also inherited from the father is the speaker's kind of distance, that steeliness. So it's taken a personal poem, but it has that emotional distance from it. All right, let's wrap this thing up. You're getting the gist of it. Okay, we have just references, kind of like in the Bloom essay. This essay, we're referencing Keats, we're referencing Pound, we're referencing Shakespeare, we're referencing the classic. And here's again what I was saying and Eliot's arguing. The point of view which I'm struggling to attack is perhaps related to the metaphysical theory of the substantial unity of the soul. For my meaning is that the poet has not a personality to express. Eliot's all for the kind of pushing the personality back, but a particular medium, which is only a medium and not a personality, in which impressions and experiences combine in peculiar and unexpected ways. Kind of like with Bloom, with identity, I think these things can never be separated. I think they intertwine and overlap. However, part of me agrees with Eliot that, when I'm reading a book of poems, where I'm reading a bunch of poems, I don't want 5, 10, 15, 20 poems in a row of the poet just dumping their emotional baggage on me. There has to be some artistic, historical medium engaged where the poet's engaging with other art, where the poet's engaging with these other things. So And then we have Eliot here too railing against the emotions. It is not in his personal emotions, the emotions provoked by particular events of his life, that the poet is in any way remarkable or interesting. And, a lot of the poems we're reading fight this, because we do have a lot of poems and poets who are using their lives. His particular emotions may be simple or crude or flat. The emotion in his poetry will be a very complex thing, but not with the complexity of the emotions of people who have very complex or unusual emotions in life. One error, in fact, of eccentricity in poetry is to seek for new human emotions to express, and in this search for novelty in the wrong place, it discovers the perverse. The business of the poet, I like this though here. This is important. The business of the poet is not to find new emotions, but to use the ordinary ones, and in working them into poetry, to express feelings which are not in actual emotions at all. And emotions which he has never experienced will serve his turn as well as those familiar to him. Consequently, we must believe that emotion recollected in tranquility is an inexact formula, for it is neither emotion, nor recollection, nor without distortion of meaning tranquility. So again, it's not, we're taking these emotions and they have to be incorporated and infused in poetry in this historical sense, in an artistic sense, in an aesthetic sense. What Eliot's railing against is just the lone poet saying, I'm sad. You have to quantify that. You have to make those emotions do interesting things. You can't just repeat what's been repeated before. You have to, as all of our poems are going toward, you have to break cliche. And I want to end with this part here. And Eliot, Bloom's essay is highly influenced by Eliot, where we have to know what has come before us, but then we have to take that and break that. I like this moment. There is a great deal in the writing of poetry which must be conscious and deliberate. In fact, the bad poet is usually unconscious where he ought to be conscious, and conscious where he ought to be unconscious. Both errors tend to make him personal. Poetry is not a turning loose of emotion. This is Eliot. I mean, you might argue with this, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. But of course, only those who have personality and emotions know what it means to want to escape these things. I love that. I think a lot of the poems we read mix these two. They can have their personal emotions and their personal stuff, but it's highly constructed and made into art. This is where this essay is highly influential in the history of poetic thinking. It's one of the biggest essays of the 20th century. But I do think we could amend it and obviously change it to fit different modes of contemporary poetry. So once again, Eliot's looking at tradition in poetry. We need to know what has come before us. You could plug in any art for that. But then we take that tradition and make it into our own writing, our own thinking, our own creation of new poetic